All right, everybody, welcome to the SpaceX Bagholder Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the revenue numbers that came out for Anthropic and OpenAI last week as both those companies prepare for IPO and how that relates to SpaceX. SpaceX, of course, selling compute to the frontier AI companies. So we need these companies to do well, and it is a bit of a mixed bag. So let's definitely get right into it. Just as a reminder, SpaceX's AI segment absolutely depends on the continued success of basically all American frontier AI model companies, including OpenAI and Anthropic. These are the companies that are keeping the lights on. They're paying SpaceX the bills. If you take all of the gigawatt compute that SpaceX has and they were only serve Grok, they would not be making much money, right? So we want to sell compute to these companies, and these companies need to be successful in order to buy the compute. So here we go. Let's dive into the numbers. So ending the second quarter of 2026, it looks like Anthropic's ARR is $65 billion. This is growing 143% sequentially over Q1. And OpenAI, their exit ARR for Q2 2026 looks like it's $40 billion, growing only 18% sequentially. Now, these top line numbers, they say one thing. If you just looked at that, it would seem like Anthropic is running away with it. But really what people are honing in on, and what I think we should focus on, is at the tail end of Q2, going into Q3, we're talking about July and early August, the growth for Anthropic actually slowed considerably. Like, there was a lot of growth in Q1, a lot of growth early in Q2, but then towards the tail end, Anthropic actually was barely growing at all, while OpenAI significantly accelerated at the end of Q2 and early Q3 with the release of their 5.6 Sol product. Despite Fable coming out, 5.6 Sol from OpenAI is clearly outcompeting Anthropic as of late for growth. Now, you can look at this a couple of ways. Of course, you can just straightforwardly say, hey, Anthropic is a paying customer of SpaceX. OpenAI is not. So, on the surface, it might just seem like we want Anthropic to do well, and we don't really care what OpenAI does well. I don't think that's correct. Now, just a quick side note, on a personal level, I really don't like Anthropic as a company. I don't like how they're approaching AI. I don't like how their leader talks about AI. But, of course, as a shareholder of SpaceX, and, in terms of what this podcast is about, in terms of getting value for SpaceX, we want Anthropic to do well because they're paying. But we also want OpenAI to do well, and we also want open source AI to do well. Because, and by the way, open source AI is absolutely booming in Q2, and in Q3, it's growing the fastest out of all of these three AI segments mentioned so far. And all of this is good because, there's a fixed amount of, there's a fixed but growing and fungible pool of compute in the world, right? There's a certain number of data centers in the United States that can serve inference on tokens for which model. And whenever any specific model, or whenever consumption overall goes up, it raises the value of the remaining compute. So even if you're selling compute solely for Anthropic, if all the other data centers are getting increasingly tied up serving inference for any other model, of course, the compute that you have becomes more scarce. So we want everybody to do well. We want token consumption to go up as a whole. Having said that, you really can't look at what's happening at the tail end of Q2 for Anthropic and say that's good for SpaceX or Anthropic or AI in general. This is because, at the end of Q2, and even to this day, Anthropic has the most intelligent, smartest model, and that they're charging the biggest premium for, right? Fable 5 is, in terms of availability to the general public, that is the smartest model available to the public, and yet it's not leading to a lot of revenue for Anthropic. In fact, the information has the mixed share of Anthropic revenue going to Fable stuck at around 10%. So it launched, it went up to 10%, then it was banned for a while, it went back down to 0, then it launched again, and the mix shift went up to around 10%, and it's been stuck at 10%. The remaining 90% are other models that Anthropic is serving. So you have to ask, they have the smartest model, but this model is not really driving revenue. And you have to imagine that's going to be bad. Because if people were to pay a premium for a model, then everyone that's serving that model throughout the value chain here would get paid. Like, Anthropic's margins would be very high for this product, and of course they would be willing to pay more to the data center layer, and this would be SpaceX, in order to serve that model. And people are not paying that premium, so that's not going to flow down. So we really have to understand why and see if there are any other ways to juice demand here. And to understand why, like, the current trajectory is not sufficient, let's re-examine the numbers that I just mentioned, right? 65 billion ARR exiting Q2 for Anthropic and 40 billion ARR for OpenAI. So this is a combined of 105 billion. Elon had set an ambitious target of monetizing at $50 billion per gigawatt, and he wants 2 gigawatts at the end of 2026 for SpaceX, and this is supposed to generate 100 billion in ARR. Well, who's going to pay the ARR? Like, the customers of SpaceX, the frontier model companies here, they need to make a lot of money in order to pay SpaceX the money. If we want SpaceX to have 100 billion in compute ARR at the end of 2026 and 300 to 400 billion at the end of 2027, well, then the combined revenues going to the frontier model company customers, OpenAI and Anthropic, has got to be a lot higher than that. In the past few years, Anthropic has like well over 10x their revenues year over year. But we are definitely getting to the stage in which their numbers are big enough that in order to 10x again and then to pay SpaceX a portion of that for compute, then there need to be significant drivers or new markets or new TAM expansions, total addressable market expansions, in order to get this done. It definitely is not a given at this point that simply releasing a more intelligent model will drive exponential growth into the company. So we'll take a look at what's been driving the growth so far and what can drive the growth in the future. Of course, we will add the caveat here that SpaceX is definitely not just selling to Anthropic. Of course, they have deals with Anthropic, they have deals with Google, Reflection, a whole suite of other companies, including an undisclosed some $6 billion contract. We're going to assume that's the Pentagon, which is why they cannot disclose it, despite it being so material in which they would usually disclose it. So, and of course, they also make money serving Grok. So it's not like, hey, the total amount of money here is capped to Anthropic plus OpenAI, but they certainly are important. Anyways, getting back to the topic. What I wanted to explain here is why I think Fable and simply having a more intelligent model is not enough. And that is how I myself am using this product. Again, I'm a software engineer. I'm working for a fairly large company here. So when you're thinking of AI spend on a software application, there really are two different and very distinct lanes here. One, which is what's been driving revenue thus far for these for the AI companies, is the model that is involved in developing and creating the application. So a coder, instead of Googling something or hand rolling some code, they'll just ask Claude to do it, right? So that's one lane. And in this lane, you definitely do want the smartest model. But the other lane is if you have an AI software application, what the customer is getting, what you're going to serve the customer, and that your incentives are totally different. You want to serve the cheapest model possible that gets the job done. And each day that passes, the more an open source like Chinese model, open source any nationality model can get this job done for a very cheap price, and there's no reason to pay Anthropic or OpenAI for it. We'll just take an example here of, let me think of an example. Let's just say Duolingo. Are you guys familiar with Duolingo? This is a language learning app. If you want to learn Spanish, if you want to learn French, then you interact with this app. This is an app that is very, very good match for AI integration, because AI LLMs are very good at translation. So this is a real big boom for Duolingo when LLMs came onto the scene. Now, initially they were very expensive. Of course, paying OpenAI for ChatGPT in order to do the translation, that's one thing. But recently their margins have improved significantly because they were able to use Chinese open source models. And this is the perfect example for what I'm talking about here, because imagine you're a developer on the Duolingo team. When you are writing the Duolingo app, you are going to be using Fable, or you're going to be using the smartest possible model that is available to you as a developer, because you want the code and you want the application to be pristine. However, when you have an AI layer that the customer is interacting with, let's say the customer is talking to the AI and you want to check to see if their sentence is it matches whatever the prompt was. It's appropriate, like the customer answered the question correctly, they translated the sentence correctly, or if they're talking to the AI, because right now they have text AIs, things like that. When you're serving the AI to the customer, you're not going to be serving them Fable. That would be ridiculous for you to do. It'd be way too prohibitively expensive for your company to do that, but also you don't need that. You don't need a super genius to translate a sentence from Spanish to English. You're going to use the cheapest AI that is available. In this case, it's whatever Chinese open source model it is. So you have the revenue that you're using to make the application, that's really capped. What is the growth available at this point for additional sort of coding stuff? And that's what we have to be concerned about. And then the revenue, the AI that you're serving your customer, that's going to Chinese open source model. Of course, that's good in the sense that I talked about earlier. All growth in compute is good because you're taking away compute that otherwise would be, like, you're making compute more scarce. That's good. But if it's not going to a frontier AI company, then that company cannot turn around and pay SpaceX. So if you're a frontier American AI company like OpenAI, Anthropic, SpaceX, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of your consumers and ask yourself, how would we justify spending money for an intelligence premium? Like, is there a product that justifies that intelligence? Why do I need to spend money for a 160 IQ person to do this when a 110 IQ person can do it for 90% cheaper? And to this point, you have to look back. Imagine, remember early on when AI first came out onto the scene with ChatGPT, it was just the web interface. It was a web chat interface, right? So you would type in that a box, you would get an answer back. If you're coding, you would type in a question, maybe you post a snippet of code and you get some code back, and then you manually copy and paste that back into your code. So there's a lot of friction there, so your total addressable market is limited because it was a bit of a difficulty to work with. After that, came Claude Code and what we're going to call the harness era. Claude Code is where you're opening up this thing in your terminal and you're asking Claude to do something, and rather than having to copy your code base or snippets of your code into the web app, it can browse your computer through it can use the terminal, go through the directory structure and look for what it wants automatically, and then spit your code out right into your repo. It eliminated so much friction that it really drove growth at both Anthropic and OpenAI. OpenAI using their Codex harness, of course. When you make stuff simpler like this, you increase the total addressable market here. But this is what we're talking about when we say it's capped out. Because if your total addressable market is just software engineers asking your harness to help out with code, how much more growth is there? You need to expand beyond that, and I really think that's what Grokbot is showing. It's showing that, hey, this new market is possible. Now, for those who haven't used Grokbot before, it's one step past the harness. It's very open. It's like a better version of OpenClaw, if you remember that craze back at the tail end of last year. It's a better version of Hermes agent. And to explain how this would work in a sort of corporate environment, imagine you have a boss, and under him is another layer of management, and under that manager you're going to have your individual contributor who's writing the code. So right now the boss would give the manager a high level, hey, we want to do X, Y, or Z. The manager would break that up into different components and then hand them off to the individual contributor. And right now the individual contributor is just taking those components that the manager made, those Jira issues, and putting them into Claude Code. Claude is doing all the work, and then the individual contributor is going to go back to the manager and say, hey, everything's done, right? So it makes the individual contributor's life a lot easier. They're just sending everything to Claude, but there's still layers of management it needs to go through. Now, if you have a fully functioning sort of AI agent rather than simply a harness, then you would be able to eliminate some of these layers. Like the manager layer, instead of delegating to an engineer and the engineer using Claude for the individual pieces, the manager would be able to delegate to like the Grokbot itself. It's the agent that Grokbot represents is an employee like wholesale replacement rather than simply a productivity increaser. You can hand it larger tasks and it would be able to break them up autonomously and work with other quote unquote Grok employees and do the work. Now, none of this is limited to Grok. Like Anthropic or OpenAI, if Grokbot takes off, can easily copy and paste this sort of thing. Like in the back end, you have to imagine they just need to figure out how to do the memory retrieval thing. Of course, each model has a limited context length in which it can operate. Like if you have too much things in your context, then your model gets dumb. So to get around this in the back, they just have a bunch of markdown files, I'm assuming, and you need to be able to have your agent search the markdown files for the specific memory or what have you. Anyways, like the application design around that can significantly increase your total addressable market. And in order for this to really take off, you need a smarter underlying model as well. Right now, Grokbot uses 4.6, Grok 4.6. 4.7 is looking very promising. And when that comes, I imagine you might see some takeoff of this. And what we really want to see, besides just takeoff of Grokbot, is adoption by the other frontier AI companies. Because again, that would, if you imagine like having wholesale employee replacement rather than making that employee's life easier. We're going to ignore the societal question here. We're just going to talk about value it drives to the AI company itself and how much token spend a company would be willing to spend on this product. And of course, if you have if you're just giving your employees a budget for how much tokens that they are capable of sending, you might get a few hundred, you might get $1,000 a month or so. But if you're talking about replacing the employee with like a hyper intelligent agent working autonomously as a bot, then really you're willing to spend up to the salary of that person. Like if you're paying the software engineer $150,000 a year, then you can justify spending $150,000 a year on a Grokbot sort of stand-in for that employee, rather than paying that employee $150,000 and then on top of that giving them $1,000 a month in terms of token spend. So in this case, your spend has gone up from, let's say, $12,000 a year up to the salary of that employee, which is $150,000 or so a year. This is like really, if you think about it, this is what could drive additional demand for AI in the near-term future. With that in mind, looking forward to September, we're anticipating releases from all three, and three I'm including SpaceX here. We're anticipating GPT-6 from OpenAI, this being their Astra project. We're expecting Fable 5.1 from Anthropic, and then we're expecting Grok 4.7 from SpaceX. And from what we've seen so far, and from like what I've laid out, it really does seem like just having a new best, smartest model is not going to be enough in and of itself. They need to come up with a application similar to Grokbot that makes it so that there is a need for the use of the smartest model outside software engineers using it to write their code. Else, then you're just going to have at the consumer layer all the AI consumption being taken up by the cheaper open source Chinese models. And like, just to be clear here, if you're a infrastructure player, like SpaceX, if you own the data center, it really is not terrible that open source is taking off. In fact, it's very good. Even besides the scarcity aspect, like if you take your NVIDIA GPUs and you serve an open source model and then you charge your margin, you're still making money off this. So if you're any sort of neo cloud, if you're a hyperscaler or anything, and you have your GPUs available to serve inference on, and you serve an open source model that is in demand, and then you charge your margin, you are making money. But in order to make $50 billion per gigawatt, which is what SpaceX is monetizing at and what we want to continue monetizing at, then you do definitely need the premium models in play in order to get that sort of monetization. So that's pretty much that. Look for any sort of increased use or traffic about Grokbot. Now, if you're on X, you do see some, but they're really from the Elon fanboys, like the people who are, let's say, my peers, right? They're the ones who are super hyped about this. It needs to escape this sort of containment layer, or the people who are super bullish or have a vested interest in the success of SpaceX in order to see it really work. Like, if you used it, the concept is definitely there, but the underlying model, Grok 4.6, is not smart enough for you to turn any actual operations over to this bot. The idea that the AI can have its own virtual machine, its own computer, then use computer use to do the task that you delegated to it, it's obviously the concept is going to be a huge hit. The model right now is not smart enough to do it. It's not smart enough to do it at a good enough rate. So this is why we need the smartest model. And then we give it over to this sort of computer use Grokbot AI agent, and hopefully that will drive revenues in the future. Again, in order for SpaceX to hit any of the revenue targets we want it to hit, then Anthropic and OpenAI, they need to combine for well over $1 trillion in ARR. So let's hope that this idea takes off and drives the revenue that we're hoping it drives. Remember, like, the important part is this concept is now in the it's in the zeitgeist, right? So the concept is there, but we really need the fundamental model improvements on the back end in order for this concept to actually take off in terms of usefulness. Grok 4.6 is not there right now. So hopefully GPT-6 Astra is the one that does this. That's going to come out in September. We're really hoping for a step change in capability here. The capabilities need to go up in order for the total addressable market to go up. Fable 5.1 is probably going to be like an incremental improvement. Like, we're really sort of disappointed with Anthropic here because they've been incremental improvements ever since Opus 4.6 came out. It's like, oh, it gets a little better coding, but that's not what's going to get us there. So let's see what happens in September. That's pretty much all I have to say for the numbers that came out for OpenAI, AI, and Anthropic. There's some other news items. It looks like the launch for Starship Flight 14 has been pushed back from the end of August into the middle of September. There was a new FCC notice that said the no earlier than date, the net date, is September 15th. So 2-week delay is, of course, we would prefer this rocket to launch earlier, but it is what it is. But the more concerning thing is actually Elon on Twitter said that he hopes that the ship catch happens in the next quote unquote few months. Well, that was not the original plan. The original plan was to catch it on Flight 14, which is supposed to go up in a couple weeks here. So either he made a typo, that's the best case scenario, or they're actually not going to try to catch the ship, which would actually be a rather huge disappointment here. Because okay, if they go orbital and they deploy Starlink V3s in an orbital trajectory, that's still okay. Okay, so that's gotta be the at least. If they're just doing another rehash of Flight 12 and Flight 13, like, what are we doing? Like, we've seen this ship go and land. The booster is finicky, but the ship is definitely operational and can survive re-entry. So, like, why are we not catching this thing? So hopefully we get some more clarity on that. Other than that, we can just hope that they deploy to orbit. And that wraps up today's episode. My name is Smelly Fingernail. I am the world's #1 bag holder of SpaceX. My current position is 1,546 shares at a cost average of $208.65. All right, I'll see you next time, hopefully later in this week.